There are certain shows and movies that you watch as a kid that leave what I can only describe as a scar. A lot of the time you're too young and the memories are too hazy for you to remember the full details of what it was that left them. Instead, what you end up with are flashes, snapshots of images and moments in time that have seared themselves into your brain. An empty-eyed woman cradling the charred body of a dead baby in the smoking ruins of a devastated city. A bunker full of desperate officials descending into despair and panic as they realise that no help is coming. A bandaged and mutilated man in a weirdly clean traffic warden uniform running a concentration camp with brutal efficiency. For the longest time, Threads was a movie that existed only in the dark recesses of my childhood mind. Something watched once upon a time, probably on an old VHS tape. A barely understood boogeyman hiding in the shadows under my bed. Dormant perhaps, but never quite forgotten. And since it's a film that people keep asking me about on live streams, especially at this time of year, well, I guess it's time to pull back the covers and haul this thing out into the light. For those that have never heard of it before, Threads is a low-budget BBC docudrama about the impact of a nuclear war in the UK, told from the perspective of the various civilians and government officials living in and around the city of Sheffield. Now, I'll admit, it sounds pretty dry on the surface, the kind of stodgy, fact-heavy, stiff upper lip stuff that you'd be forced to watch in high school history class while you daydreamed about getting it on with one of the girls behind the bike sheds. But fuck me, nothing could prepare you for the impact of watching this thing back then. This movie is pure nightmare fuel, conjuring up a remarkably effective atmosphere of tension and impending doom, brutally impactful images of destruction and chaos during the strike, and a hauntingly memorable final act that promises no happy endings for anyone. The film's first act sets up the main players and neatly establishes the circumstances that lead to the war. A Soviet invasion of Iran provokes a confrontation with the US, and as working class people in Sheffield try to go about their daily lives, you can already see the clouds of war gathering on the horizon. Panic buying, rising prices, civil unrest, and increasingly alarming public service announcements become the norm. And what's so unsettling about this is how real and matter-of-fact it all feels, all delivered in that clipped, efficient, received pronunciation that was the hallmark of BBC broadcasts at the time. And it's quite interesting to watch how the various characters react to it. Like, at first everyone's pretty chill and not really taking it seriously, but as the tensions ramp up and the news reports start to get more serious, you can practically feel the change in atmosphere. Suddenly people aren't just listening to the news in the background while they do other stuff, they're glued to the TV or the radio with that kind of silent, intense look that tells you shit's about to go down and everyone knows it. And in the middle of all this is a young woman named Ruth who's just told her boyfriend Jimmy that she's pregnant, and even though the baby wasn't planned, they intend to get married and make a go of it. It's the kind of storyline you've seen a million times before, just another tiny human drama in the middle of world-changing events. And all too soon, those events become extremely real when war breaks out and the nuke starts dropping early one morning. And this is where Threads goes from a tense, character-driven drama to absolute nightmare fuel as Sheffield cops a direct impact. Before you know it, characters are dying left, right and centre, killed by collapsing buildings, incinerated in the firestorms, or in some cases, venturing out to look for loved ones and just disappearing, their fates forever unknown. And it's remarkable what this movie was able to achieve with a pretty modest budget, showing you just enough to give you a sense of the scale of the destruction, while intercutting it with little glimpses of individual people horribly killed or struggling to survive in the ruins. Damn man, I don't even know how much of this stuff I can show here on YouTube, but trust me, they did not hold back on the grisly imagery. The attack itself is bad enough, but the worst is very much yet to come. As radioactive fallout settles over the country, hospitals are overwhelmed with casualties, the government is cut off, and pretty soon, law and order breaks down completely as the survivors fight for whatever supplies are left. And in the midst of all this chaos, a heavily pregnant Ruth struggles to stay alive and ultimately deliver her baby. And in some ways, I think the final act of this movie contains the most haunting aspects of the whole production, the realization that this is it. Things are not going to get better, nobody's coming to help them, civilization is not going to rebuild, and the world will never be what it was again. A decade after the war, the survivors are struggling to eke out an existence in a barren, irradiated Britain that's regressed into a kind of pre-industrial farming society. The generation that's grown up in this world are stunted, physically and emotionally. When Ruth finally dies, blind and prematurely aged, her daughter just kind of looks at her. There's no sign of mourning or sadness for losing a loved one, she just walks away like she doesn't even care. This is a generation that knows only survival in a hard and brutal world. A generation that doesn't have time for love and sentimentality. And when a man forces himself on her and she drags herself into a filthy, makeshift hospital to give birth months later, the final freeze frame of the movie is of her horrified face as she looks at her stillborn baby for the first time. As I say, this is not a story of happy endings. Threads was a pretty controversial movie when it released back in the mid-80s. The creators had set out to shock the public by showing them the grim reality of what nuclear war would actually look like, and in that respect, they definitely succeeded. There was a kind of national shock in the wake of Threads, not some big social media backlash or a boycott like you see today, but more like everyone just kind of sat back in silence when it was over, emotionally numbed by what they'd seen. But what's so impressive about Threads is how well it holds up even today, how shocking it manages to be, and how deep an impact it manages to make. And I think a lot of that comes down to how realistic it feels. By all accounts, the writer Barry Hines had a lot of experience writing down-to-earth, working-class characters, and the decision to set Threads in an industrial city like Sheffield really plays up to that. All of the characters in this movie talk, act, and most importantly, look like regular people. There's no impossibly beautiful women or square-jawed heroes coming to save the day here. The actors look like the kind of plain, anonymous people that you'd pass in the street every day. The early scenes are very much a grounded slice-of-life drama with all the usual gripes and angsts of regular people, so it's all the more jarring and disturbing when the bombs start falling and it all gets torn apart. I really like the scenes in the government bunker where local officials are scrambling to respond to the disaster, and it's all very busy and frantic and official at first, but then as time passes the mood becomes more and more hopeless, the suits and ties are discarded, and the chain of command starts to break down as they all slowly come to the realization that nobody is going to rescue them. They're all going to die down there in a dingy underground office. And all of this compelling human drama is punctuated by voiceover narration and occasional bits of text painting a broader picture of what's happening, all delivered in a very detached, matter-of-fact style that's wildly at odds with what you're seeing on screen. It's a genius move that blurs the line between factual documentary and nightmarish fiction, and again, it just makes everything hit that little bit harder. Threads was written to be a cautionary tale by people who had a very serious point to make, and I think they made it in the most effective way they could, making the absolute most out of very limited resources to produce a grim, shocking, relentlessly bleak and haunting drama that's still being talked about 40 years after it was released. And if you haven't seen it yet, then I think it's about time you picked up the Threads. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.